A match flared at the edge of Catherine Hale's yard, and for half a second the whole world turned the color of sickly gold. Frost shone on the grass. The fence leaned where it always leaned. Smoke crawled out of the chimney like it was trying not to be seen. Then the flame dipped, and what stayed behind was the sound of horses shifting in the dark, and a man's voice saying he'd come to take what was rightfully his. I'm telling you this one tonight on Savage West Stories because it isn't a tale about a fast gun or a clean victory. It's about a slow kind of hunger, the kind that makes decent people do quiet arithmetic in their heads and call it justice. This was Wyoming Territory, 1883, outside a young town called Sheridan, where the boards were still fresh enough to smell like sap when the sun hit 'em. Catherine's place sat out by the creek, on land that looked hopeful from a distance and unforgiving once you tried to live on it. One small cabin, one lean-to, one boy, Micah, with thin wrists and a face that tried to be brave even when his stomach didn't agree. If you've never been hungry on the northern plains, you might think hunger is loud, like shouting, like begging. It's not. Hunger is quiet. It makes people careful. It makes choices sharp. A few days before that match ever lit up her yard, Catherine stood in town with an empty basket and a shawl pulled tight against the wind. She'd walked into a dry goods store that carried flour, coffee, salt pork, all the things that kept a body moving when winter had its teeth in you. She didn't ask for much. She didn't ask for free. She asked for credit. The shopkeeper didn't even bother to lower his voice, like humiliation was just part of the price. No credit, he snapped, already turning away, already done with her. Not for widows, not for children, not for anybody who didn't have cash that clinked when it hit the counter. Catherine could have argued. Folks did. She could have begged. Folks did that too. But she didn't. She just nodded once, quiet, and stepped back out into the street with her chin up like it mattered. Because out there it did. Crying in the middle of a frontier town was like bleeding in wolf country. You didn't get comfort, you got watched. The wind cut down the main street, lifting dust off the packed dirt and throwing it against her skirt. Her stomach ached in that dull way it does after you've gone without long enough to stop feeling dramatic about it. And she kept walking because she had no other choice. That's when she saw him. He was leaning outside the livery, half in shade, arms crossed, hat low. His coat was worn but clean. His boots looked like they'd known more miles than rest. And there was something steady about him that you notice even if you don't want to. Like the world could shove and he just set his feet and take it. He wasn't pretending not to look at her. He watched her straight on, the way a man does when he's already decided that truth matters more than manners. "You get turned away?" he asked. Simple question, but it hit like a hand on a bruise. Catherine could have lied. Pride makes liars out of good people. Habit does too. But she glanced past him at the horses, at the men hovering near warmth and gossip, and she thought about Micah's face when he tried to pretend he wasn't hungry. So she told the truth with a small nod. "I'll figure something out," she said, because that's what a mother says even when she doesn't believe it. The man pushed off the post and took a step closer, not crowding her, not looming, just closing the distance like he meant what he was about to say. "Come with me. I'll see you've got supper." Now think about that for a second. Out here in 1883, a lone man offering help wasn't automatically a blessing. Sometimes it was a hook with bait on it. Sometimes it was the beginning of a different kind of debt. Catherine knew that. You don't survive long without learning it. She tightened her grip on the basket handle like she could squeeze dignity out of wicker. "I can't take charity," she said, because she meant it. "It ain't charity," he answered, steady as an old nail. "It's supper." She finally looked up at him again, really looked. His eyes were kind, but not soft. There was a crease at the corner of his mouth, like he'd smiled once a long time ago and then forgot the habit. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. Mid-30s maybe. And there was something settled in him, something that didn't need to prove itself. She didn't know if that meant safety, but she knew what hunger meant. So she nodded. The man gave a small nod back, like they'd made a plain agreement. Then he turned toward the livery and the waiting wagon, like the decision was done and all that was left was the work of keeping people alive. Out on that road and leaving Sheridan behind, the land opens up the way it always does in Wyoming Territory. It's almost insulting how big it gets. Brown grass laid flat by wind, cottonwoods stripped down to bone along the creek, and the Bighorn Mountains sitting out there like a cold witness that never blinks. Whitlo drove the buckboard like he'd been born with reins in his hands. No rush, no show, just steady. The kind of steady you notice when you've lived a life where most things wobble. Catherine sat beside him with her shawl clutched tight, her empty basket at her feet, and her thoughts doing circles in her head. 'Cause here's the truth you don't say out loud in town. A man offering help on the frontier might be kindness, or it might be a trap that looks like kindness, and Catherine knew the difference could get a woman hurt. But she also knew what it meant to go home empty. The ride wasn't chatty, but it wasn't heavy either. It was that rare kind of silence where you can actually breathe. The wagon creaked over ruts, the horse's breath puffed white in the cold. Dust rose behind them in a thin trail, catching the late-day sun like smoke that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Catherine watched Whitlo's hands a few times when she thought he wouldn't notice. Weathered hands, working hands, calm. It had been a long time since she'd been around a man who didn't feel like a question she had to answer. They followed the creek for a stretch, the water running dark and slow, and then the cabin came into view, small, patched, stubborn. You could spot the fixes from a distance. Tar paper on the roof, a fence line that leaned like it was tired, hope nailed down with whatever wood a person could find. And there on the porch stood Micah, barefoot, thin, still as a fence post, watching the wagon roll in like he didn't trust good things to arrive without a price. Whitlo glanced at Catherine, just a quick look. "That your boy?" "Yes," she said, "Micah." The wagon stopped, and Catherine climbed down before it was fully settled, and Micah ran to her like he'd been holding his breath all day. She grabbed him and held on tight enough to feel his ribs under his shirt, and in that moment she realized how close she'd been to failing him. Not because she didn't try, because winter doesn't care how hard you try. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "We have a guest," she said, voice low. "He's going to help us tonight." Micah's eyes flicked up at Whitlo, wide and wary. And Micah, being 7 and honest in a way adults forget how to be, asked the only question that mattered. "You got food?" Whitlo's mouth twitched, like the idea almost amused him. "I got more than that. You like rabbit stew?" Micah grinned so fast it looked like it surprised even him. "I do." Whitlo started unloading the wagon without ceremony. Beans, potatoes, flour, salt pork, a wrapped cut of meat that looked like venison, and a little sack of coffee that probably cost him more than he wanted to admit. Catherine stood there with her throat tight, watching supplies pile up on her poor porch like they belonged there, like abundance could just show up if a man decided it should. She opened her mouth to protest, or thank him, or do something that felt proper. Whitlo didn't give her time. He just looked at her and said, "Let's cook." Inside, the cabin was small and dim, but it took warmth fast once the stove caught. Whitlo moved around the kitchen like he'd done it before, like work didn't threaten his pride. He chopped vegetables with a steady rhythm. Catherine mixed flour and water for biscuits, hands working on habit while her mind stayed halfway outside, still listening for trouble. Micah sat at the table, eyes locked on the pot as if staring might make it boil faster. The smell of meat and onions filled the room and changed the air. Not just comfort, something else. A reminder of what life could be when it wasn't all scraping and counting. Catherine watched Whitlo for a minute and finally said, almost without meaning to, "You cook like a ranch wife." Whitlo didn't look up. Raised on a ranch, had to learn. That was all he gave her. No stories dressed up pretty, no excuses, just a fact. They ate until Micah's shoulders dropped and his eyes went soft with relief. The boy talked with his mouth half full and didn't apologize one time, and Catherine didn't correct him, not tonight. Tonight wasn't for manners. Tonight was for survival, for letting the child remember what it felt like to be fed. After supper, Whitlo helped clear the table. Again, no show, just hands doing what hands should do. Then he stepped outside while Catherine tucked Micah into bed. When she came back out, Whitlo was leaning against the porch rail, staring up at the stars. The night had that sharp edge to it, the kind that tells you snow is somewhere nearby, just waiting to arrive. Catherine stood beside him, not too close. "Thank you," she said. Whitlo tipped his head slightly. "Any time." She shook her head once. "You didn't have to." He held her gaze. "No, I didn't." And that's when Catherine understood something that made her chest feel strange. He wasn't doing this to be praised. He wasn't doing this to buy a place in her life. He was doing it like a man trying to live with himself. She swallowed, the words coming quieter than she expected. "You're kind." Whitlo gave a small shrug, almost dismissive. "I don't know about that." "You are," she said, because she'd seen enough of the other kind of men to recognize the difference. He looked at her then, really looked, and the porch boards creaked under both their boots like the cabin was listening. "It doesn't have to be the last time," he said. Catherine's heart picked up, not with fear, with something she hadn't let herself touch in a long while. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, and it came out steadier than she felt. Whitlo didn't hesitate. "I will." Catherine smiled, real, full, almost surprised by its own existence. "Good." Whitlo tipped his hat, stepped down off the porch, and climbed into his wagon. The wheels creaked as he turned back towards town. And just before the bend, he looked back once. Catherine was still standing there, watching the road like it had started to mean something. Out there, that's how a new kind of trouble begins. Sometimes it's the good kind, sometimes it isn't. But either way, it never starts with a gun. It starts with someone coming back when they said they would. Morning came in like it always does on that stretch of Wyoming. Quiet, bright, and mean. A thin crust of ice sat in the ruts by Catherine Hale's cabin, and the sky looked so clean you'd almost think it was friendly. It wasn't. A clean sky out there usually just means the wind has nothing to slow it down. Catherine was up before Micah, moving around that little cabin the way a person moves when they're trying not to wake a child who finally slept with a full belly. She fed the stove another stick of wood, listened to it catch, and stood for a moment with her shawl tied around her shoulders, watching the breath of smoke crawl out of the chimney like it was cautious too. Then she saw it, fresh hoof prints in the lane. Just one set, not a crowd, not trouble yet. But on the frontier you learn not to trust yet. She didn't touch the tracks, just stared at them like they were a letter she wasn't sure she wanted to read. And a little later, when the sound finally reached her, slow hooves, steady, unhurried, she felt her chest tighten and then settle again in the same breath. Celas Whitlo rode in like he said he would. No flourish, no big grin, coat buttoned high, collar up against the bite of the morning. He swung down from the saddle with that same controlled weight, like the ground owed him nothing and he wasn't about to argue with it. When his eyes met Catherine's, it didn't feel like a question. It felt like an answer that had already been decided. "You find your way all right?" she asked, because it was something safe to say. "I did," he told her. "Road's rougher past the creek. Horse didn't mind." Micah watched from inside with that cautious, half-awake look kids get when they're trying to judge whether a grown man is friend, stranger, or something worse. Whitlo didn't try to win him over. He just nodded once, like Micah was a person worth acknowledging. "Morning, son," Whitlo said. "You help your mama with the chores?" Micah sat up a little straighter. "I carry wood, feed the hens, too." "That's good work," Whitlo replied, plain and steady. "Cabin this size doesn't run by itself. Now, you and I both know how rare that is, an adult talking to a child like the child's effort actually counts. Out there, that kind of respect can feed a boy almost as much as stew." Catherine mentioned the fence line out back, where a deer had pushed through. She expected a shrug, or a polite, "maybe later." Instead, Whitlo just asked where the wire was, shrugged off his coat, and went to work like fixing her problems didn't bruise his pride. He didn't talk to himself, didn't curse the post, didn't make a show of being useful. He just worked. Catherine sat by the window with her sewing basket, mending Micah's shirts where the elbows had gone thin. The needle went in and out, and every so often she looked outside and watched Whitlo move along the fence with the kind of focus you can't fake. The fence slowly stood straighter. The yard looked a little less like it was losing a fight. By midday, he came in with dirt on his boots and a scrape on his forearm he didn't mention. Catherine set a plate in front of him, leftover biscuits, a little ham she had saved. Not payment, not charity, just the natural exchange of people who are surviving side by side. Whitlo ate without rushing, then looked around her place like a man looks around a job site, not judging, just noticing. "You've got a good piece of land. Water runs clear, trees for shelter." Catherine kept her eyes on her stitching. "It was my husband's." Whitlo nodded like he'd already guessed that. He didn't press, not then. And that's how the day should have gone. Quiet work, small food, the beginning of steadiness. But the land doesn't care what should happen. Later that afternoon, Catherine walked down toward the creek to check a spot where the bank had been soft. The reeds were rattling in the wind, and the water ran slow and dark under the pale light. She was halfway thinking about supper when she heard it, a faint, strained sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just life refusing to quit. She followed it to the band and found a calf tucked into the reeds, small, shivering, ribs showing. No brand, no earmark, just steam coming from its nostrils and those big frightened eyes tracking her like she might be danger or salvation. A maverick. That word sounds romantic in old stories, like free cattle just wandering around waiting for some hard-luck hero to claim them. The truth is uglier. Unbranded calves were disputes waiting to happen, and disputes over livestock could turn deadly faster than a barroom insult. Micah came running when he heard her call, and the second he saw that calf, his whole face changed. He knelt down like he'd found treasure, touched its neck, and whispered something too quiet for Catherine to hear. Catherine didn't see treasure first. She saw hoofbeats in her mind. She saw men with hard eyes and a thin line between found and stolen, and how quickly a hungry widow could be made into a villain. Whitlo arrived a little later, walking up with that same steady pace. He took one look at the calf and didn't smile. "That's trouble," he said. Catherine's voice came out tight. "It's meat or milk or trade." Whitlo crouched, checked the calf's legs, ran a hand along its side like he knew what he was looking for. Then he stood up slow. "Somebody's cow dropped it," he said. "Somebody's going to want it back." Catherine stared at the animal, then out across the empty horizon. Somebody let it freeze. And there it was, the part no one likes to talk about, how the frontier taught people to measure morality against weather, how hunger can make a person look at an abandoned thing and call it fair. Here's where things get complicated, and you know it. On paper, property looks clean. Out on the range, property is whatever a man can prove, whatever a brand book can back, and whatever a community will enforce. And the people with the biggest herds usually had the loudest friends. Whitlo didn't argue with her. He just let the truth sit between them like a cold stone. If you keep it smart. Hide it, and don't start believing the world is fair just because you're hungry. Micah looked up confused, still stroking the calf like it was already his. Catherine felt the weight of that warning settle in her chest, because she could hear what Whitlo wasn't saying. If they kept the calf, the fight wouldn't be with winter anymore. It would be with people. The next morning, Catherine Hale did what frontier women always did when the world got tight. She went looking for something small she could turn into something necessary. Eggs were about the only currency she had that didn't involve begging, stealing, or selling a piece of herself she couldn't afford to lose. She gathered them fast, hands cold, straw sticking to her sleeves, the hens fussing like they had opinions about it. Then she wrapped the basket with cloth and held it close the whole walk, like the wind might reach in and take what little value was left in it. Before she left, she went to the lean-to one more time. The calf was tucked back there, shivering in the half-dark, hidden behind a blanket draped over the rails. It was a ridiculous kind of hiding, the sort of thing you do when you know you're outmatched, but you do it anyway, because doing nothing feels like dying on purpose. Catherine pulled the blanket higher, adjusted the latch, and stood still for a beat, scanning the empty horizon. No riders, no movement, just the prairie breathing slow. So she headed for Sheridan. If you've never walked into a frontier town with worry sitting in your throat, let me tell you what it feels like. The buildings don't welcome you. They just stand there. The boardwalks creak under your boots like they're keeping records. And the people, most of them, don't look at you straight. They look around you, past you, through you, like hunger is contagious and they're trying not to catch it. Catherine felt it before she heard anything, the way conversation thinned as she passed, the way eyes shifted. Sheridan was small enough then that news didn't really travel. It appeared, like a bruise. One day your name was just a name, the next day it meant something. She pushed her hand cart along the boardwalk and stopped near the dry goods in the saloon, thinking about lamp oil, thinking about Micah, thinking about how long it would take for a hungry child to start looking older than his years. And then a man stepped out of the shadow near the saloon. Canvas coat, hat brim low, boots that hit the boards with that deliberate, measured weight of a man who expects people to make room for him. In one hand he held a little notebook, the kind ranchers used for brands and tallies. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't smile like a neighbor. "Mrs. Hale," he said, like they'd shared coffee together. Catherine's stomach dropped so hard it felt like it hit the planks. She kept her face steady anyway, because in places like that, your face is either a shield or an invitation. "Word is you've got a stray calf on your place," he went on. Catherine tightened her hands around the cart handle. "Word is wrong." He gave a smile that had no warmth in it. "Unbranded calf turns up near your creek, and now folks are saying you've had fresh meat. Funny how talk works." Now Catherine could have thrown the eggs at his boots, she could have lied bigger, she could have folded up right there and started pleading. Instead, she did something that takes more nerve than any of those. She told a careful truth. "A calf wandered in," she said. "If it belongs to someone, they can come claim it." The man's eyes didn't soften. They didn't harden either. They stayed flat, like he'd already decided what she was. "They will," he said. And right then, Catherine felt the air shift behind her, the way you feel a storm change direction before it arrives. Boots on boards, a familiar weight. She didn't have to turn to know. Celas Whitlo stepped up beside her, not touching her, not crowding, just there, close enough to matter. The detective's gaze slid to him and something sharpened, like a blade finding bone. "Whitlo," the detective said, "thought you were further south." Whitlo didn't blink. "Thought you'd learn better manners." That told Catherine plenty. These two weren't strangers, and whatever history sat between them, it wasn't the kind you laughed about over whiskey. The detective tapped his notebook against his palm, slow, casual, like a man flipping the safety off a weapon without making a show of it. "Tell your widow friend the range doesn't run on pity," the detective said. Whitlo leaned just a fraction closer. Not aggressive, not loud, just enough to make it clear he wasn't afraid. "Tell your boss the range doesn't run on theft either," Whitlo said. The detective's smile returned, still empty. "Depends who's counting." And then he turned and walked off down the boardwalk like the street belonged to him. Catherine didn't move for a moment. She watched him go, feeling every stare around her, feeling Sheridan's quiet judgment settle into place. The wind picked up and dragged dust between the buildings. Somewhere a horse stomped at a hitch rail. Somewhere a door opened and shut, like it didn't want to be part of it. Finally, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding.
Whitlo stayed at her side, steady as a fence post in hard ground. He didn't say, "Don't worry." Men who've lived know better than to say that. He didn't promise her safety either. He just stood there, and in that moment, that was the only kind of comfort the West ever really offered. Because now the situation had a shape to it. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It wasn't just winter. It was people, and people were always the worst storm. Catherine put her hand back on the cart handle and started walking again, eggs rattling softly under cloth. She didn't look back, but she could feel it. She could feel the detective's words hanging in the cold air behind her, like smoke that wouldn't clear. And Whitlo, he walked with her, quiet and watchful, like he already knew this wasn't going to end with a polite knock on the door.
That night, the wind didn't just blow around Catherine Hale's cabin. It leaned on it. It pushed at the boards like it had a grievance, like it wanted inside to see what kind of people thought they could survive out here. Inside, the kerosene lamp sputtered and steadied again. The flame threw a tired yellow circle over the table where Catherine sat with her shoulders squared and her hands folded too tight. Across from her, Celas Whitlo held a tin cup like it was something to do with his hands so he wouldn't say the wrong thing. Micah was asleep in the nook, finally quiet after a full supper and a day that had asked too much of a 7-year-old. The cabin should have felt safe with a child sleeping in it, but safety on the frontier's a strange thing. It doesn't come from walls. It comes from luck and from whether the people outside your door feel like letting you keep what you have. Catherine broke the silence first. "Who was he?" she asked. Whitlo didn't look up right away. He stared into the cup, eyes narrowed, like he was reading something in the dark liquid that wasn't there. Then he said, "A man who works for men with herds big enough to think the county belongs to 'em." Catherine let that sit. She'd heard of outfits like that. Everybody had. Big spreads, big brand books, big friendships that reached into town offices and out onto the range. The kind of power that didn't need to shout. "And you?" she asked, not accusing, just measuring, because when trouble walks up to your porch, you don't get the luxury of guessing wrong about the person standing beside you. Whitlo's mouth tightened. For the first time, the steadiness in him looked like it had a crack, not enough to break, but enough to show there was something underneath it. He spoke slow, like each sentence had weight. "I've ridden guard on stage lines," he said. "I've done day work on outfits that didn't pay on time. I've slept under wagons and in livery lofts. I've done things I'm not proud of when winter got mean." He finally lifted his eyes to hers. "But I'm not a rustler." Catherine didn't answer right away. She listened to the stove ticking as it cooled and warmed and cooled again. She listened to the wind searching the seams of the cabin. She listened to herself, because sometimes your instincts talk quieter than fear, and you have to work to hear 'em. Then she said something that surprised even her. "I don't care what men call you. I care what you do when they come." That sentence hung between them like a gate swinging on one hinge. Whitlo didn't flinch from it. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he understood the difference between reputation and character better than most men. "Then we plan for when they come. Not if, when. Out there, people didn't always threaten you twice. Sometimes the first warning was just a way to make sure you were scared before they took what they wanted." They moved like they'd rehearsed it. Catherine took the lamp. Whitlo took the lead, quiet and careful, stepping out into the cold night like he expected the dark to have eyes. The lean-to sat hunched against the cabin, half shelter, half secret. The calf was back there, tucked into straw, shivering, breathing hard. In the lamp glow, it looked even smaller, even more like a mistake made by a careless cow in an uncaring season. Catherine's hand hovered over its neck. She didn't pet it like Micah did. She didn't whisper to it. She just pressed her palm against the coarse hide and felt it tremble. Whitlo lifted the blanket, checked the rails, tightened a tie. Then he guided the calf deeper under cover with careful hands. No yanking, no chasing, just steady pressure until the animal gave up and moved where they wanted it. It felt ridiculous, hiding a living creature with a blanket and a few shadows. But that's what people do when they're cornered. They make small defenses and pray they're enough.
When the calf was settled, Whitlo crouched and looked at the ground. The moonlight and lamp glow showed tracks too clearly. Boot marks, hoof marks, a neat little story leading right to the lean-to. Whitlo dragged a broken branch through the dirt, disturbing the pattern, smearing the clean lines until they looked like nothing particular. Catherine scuffed the worst of it with her boot toe, grinding the edges down until the yard looked like it always did, messy, lived in, forgettable. Then Whitlo reached for the gate chain. He slid it through the staple slow, keeping the metal from clinking too loud, and secured it like a man locking a door against a storm he could already smell. They stood still a moment, both listening. No hoofbeats, no voices, just the wind and the faint, restless sound of the calf shifting in straw. Back inside, the warmth hit him like a wall. Catherine latched the door. The wooden click sounded too small for the size of the world outside. The lamp flame steadied and the cabin went quiet again. Quiet, but not peaceful. Micah stirred, blinking awake with hair sticking up at odd angles. He sat up, eyes searching the room, sensing something was wrong even before he knew what it was. He looked at Whitlo, then at Catherine, and asked in a small voice, "We keeping him?" Catherine went to the bed nook and knelt, taking Micah's face gently between both hands. Her thumbs pressed his cheeks like she could hold him still enough for the world to behave. She said, "We're keeping ourselves." Micah didn't fully understand, not the whole shape of it, but he understood her tone. He nodded, the way children do when they trust you more than they understand you, and his eyelids drooped again. Whitlo watched from a few steps back, his face half shadowed by lamplight. He didn't comment, he didn't offer comfort. Men like him often don't. They know comfort can turn into a promise, and promises can get people killed. He just stood there, quiet, carrying the weight of what he'd helped put into motion. And Catherine, proud, tired, stubborn Catherine, rose from Micah's bedside and looked toward the dark window like she could see the road beyond it. Because now she knew what the next days would ask of them. Not just hunger, not just cold, people, and the kind of trouble that comes wearing a hat and carrying a notebook. The next day, the sky stayed bright and cruel. You ever notice that kind of daylight? It kind of looks clean, almost pretty, but doesn't warm a thing. It's the sort of light that makes a hard place feel even harder, because it shows you everything exactly as it is. Catherine was out back splitting kindling when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, several. Coming in slow, measured steps, like the riders weren't worried about being challenged. She didn't run, she didn't call out, she just stopped, let the axe head rest on the block, and listened. Out on the frontier, you learn the difference between a man passing by and a man arriving. These hooves had purpose. Catherine stepped up onto the porch with the axe handle still in its grip, not swinging it, not threatening, just holding something solid because the world had turned soft under her feet. Whitlo came beside her a moment later, coat buttoned high, collar up, hands visible and empty. That detail matters. He wasn't trying to start a shootout, he was trying to keep one from happening. Micah hovered in the doorway behind him, half hidden, trying to be brave the way children try, by standing very still and hoping fear won't notice him. The riders stopped at the fence line, 5 of them. Not drifters, not cowboys out for a laugh. Their horses were fed, their saddles fit. They sat those animals like men who believed they had permission to be there. And then one of them did something small that Catherine would remember later like a brand on the inside of her eyelids. He struck a match. That little flare of light in the wind, in the middle of a cold yard, didn't belong. It looked like a signal. He lit a cigar slow, taking his time, letting that flame show. Now think about that for a second. If you ride out to a widow's cabin and you're so confident you stop to light a cigar, you're not there to negotiate. You're there to collect. The stock detective sat at the front, calm as if he'd come by for coffee. "Evening," he called, like the word meant something out there. "We're here for the calf." Catherine didn't step off the porch. She didn't invite him closer. She kept her voice even. "You can look. If it's yours, take it." The detective's eyes slid to Whitlo. "And if it's not?" Whitlo answered for her quiet and firm. "Then you ride off." One of the riders laughed, short and dry, like the idea of being told no was a joke they hadn't heard in a while. The detective didn't laugh. He didn't raise his voice either. That's what made him dangerous. He stayed smooth. "We've got witnesses saying you've been feeding on beef, and we've got a boy in that house who can tell us what he saw." Micah flinched behind the doorframe like the words were a hand reaching for him. Catherine's whole body tightened, not fear for herself, something sharper. "Leave my son out of your mouth," she said. The detective's tone stayed polite, the way men get polite when they know they're holding a knife. "Then hand over the calf and we'll all sleep easy." Whitlo didn't move. He didn't puff up. He didn't try to impress anyone. He just said, steady as fence wire pulled tight, "You don't threaten a child to collect a rumor." And right there in that yard you could feel how thin the territory's law really was. In town, a badge might matter. Out by a creek with 5 armed riders and nobody watching, law was just a word people used when it suited them. The wind kept moving through the cottonwoods. Dust drifted around the horses' legs. The cigar smoke blew sideways. Everything looked almost calm if you ignored the fact that one wrong breath could turn it bloody. Then one rider made it worse. He swung down from his saddle and walked to the fence. Not toward the cabin yet. He grabbed a fence rail and yanked like he owned it, like he was demonstrating something. A rail popped loose with a squeal and nails, and that sound did something to Catherine. It wasn't just wood, it was her boundary being tested, her last thin claim to order. She stepped off the porch without thinking, axe handle lifting. Whitlo murmured, barely loud enough for her to hear, "Don't." But Catherine kept moving, not fast, not wild, just a mother walking toward the line where her world ended. Because if she let them pull her fence apart like it didn't matter, what would they do next? Walk into her cabin, put hands on her boy, take everything and call it range business? The riders saw the axe and froze, fence rail hanging awkward in his grip. For one heartbeat, everyone went still. And then a gunshot cracked. Not from Catherine, not from Whitlo, from the fence line. Maybe the rider's finger slipped, maybe somebody flinched, maybe one of those men was nervous in a way he couldn't admit. I can't tell you for sure, I can only tell you what it did. It ripped the calm right in half. Horses jumped sideways, dust erupted under hooves, the calf bawled under the lean-to like it understood exactly what that sound meant. Micah screamed from the doorway, pure panic, the kind that comes from a child realizing adults can't control everything. Whitlo moved fast then. Not heroic, not cinematic, just fast. He stepped forward with his hands out, palms open, shouting for them to hold, for everyone to stop. And in the scramble, another shot answered. Whitlo staggered. No dramatic spin, no big speech, just a sudden hitch in his body, a hand clamping hard to his side, blood darkening his coat like spilled ink. Catherine dropped the axe and ran to him. She grabbed him under the arm and dragged him backward toward the porch boards, teeth clenched, boots slipping a little in loose dust. You don't realize how heavy a man is until you're trying to move him while your heart's hammering and your hands are shaking. The riders hesitated. That's the part people don't like to admit about violence. Even the men who bring it often don't know what to do once it actually happens. Once there's blood on the ground and a child screaming, the story stops feeling clean. The stock detective's face got hard. "Last chance," he called. "That calf, or next time we don't stop with warnings." Then they turned and rode off, leaving hoof prints like a signature. And Catherine stayed there on the porch edge, kneeling beside Whitlo, with Micah crying behind her and the wind still blowing like nothing had changed at all. Because the land doesn't care who gets hurt, it just keeps moving. But everything had changed.
Out there, most men don't die the way stories swear they do. They don't deliver speeches. They don't look poetic in the dirt. Most of the time, they just bleed and try to act like it isn't happening, because admitting it feels like giving the world permission to finish the job. When the riders finally disappeared down the lane, Catherine Hale didn't sit there and shake. She didn't waste a second asking herself why this had to happen to her. She grabbed Celas Whitlo under the arm and hauled him over the threshold like he was a sack of grain that had suddenly become precious. Inside that little cabin, the air was warm from the stove, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt trapped, like the walls were listening. Whitlo was pale, jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle jump. He tried to stay upright, like sitting down too fully might mean he couldn't get back up again. Blood had soaked through his coat at the ribs, dark and spreading, and Catherine's mind went cold in the way it does when panic would be useless. She got him into a chair near the stove, then reached for what she had. Not a doctor's bag, not clean bandages, just the rough practical leftovers of a frontier life. She dropped scraps of cloth on the table, grabbed her kitchen scissors, and cut his shirt open with steady hands. The sound of fabric tearing in that quiet room was sharper than any gunshot. She found the wound low on his side. Ugly, but not instantly fatal. That mattered. Out there, you learn to sort injuries into two piles fast. The ones you can fight, and the ones you can only watch. "Boil water," she told Micah. Micah had been frozen in the corner, eyes wide, mouth working like he wanted to speak but couldn't find words strong enough. He was 7, and he was learning right then that grown-ups can be hurt and the world doesn't stop. But when Catherine gave him an order, he moved. He grabbed a pail with both hands and ran for the creek, feet slapping the floorboards, breath coming hard. Fear still sat on his face, but now it had somewhere to go. Work does that for a person. It gives fear a job. Catherine filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The cabin smelled like iron and smoke and hot water, and Whitlo kept breathing through his teeth like pain was a bill he refused to pay. She cleaned what she could, packed cloth tight, and held pressure until her arms burned. Micah came back with the pail sloshing, cheeks raw with cold. He didn't cry anymore. He watched. He listened. He handed her what she needed when she asked. Kids on the frontier grew up in moments like that, whether anyone wanted them to or not. When the bleeding finally slowed, Catherine sat back on her heels, and for the first time, her hands shook. Not from weakness, from the delayed crash of realizing how close everything had come to falling apart. Whitlo's voice came out rough. "You need the sheriff." Catherine let out a single laugh, sharp, humorless. "The sheriff's 10 miles away, and 5 riders aren't going to wait polite for paperwork." Whitlo lifted his eyes to hers. Even feverish, even hurting, there was still that steadiness in him. "You need witnesses," he said. "You need town eyes on it." Now think about that for a second. Out by the creek, those riders could do whatever they wanted and call it range business. In town, where people could see and talk and remember, the rules got heavier. Not always fair, but heavier. Catherine looked at Micah, looked at Whitlo, looked at the dark window where the yard waited like an open mouth. And here's where things get complicated, because she had a choice most folks don't admit exists. She could run. Plenty of people did. Fold the blanket, pack the pot, hitch the mule, disappear into another territory where nobody knew your name. Or she could stay and let those men decide what her life was worth. She chose the harder thing. At first light, she pulled the old sled runners into place and hitched the mule. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. It was the kind of setup you use when the ground is too frozen for wheels and you don't have the luxury of waiting for better weather. They spread blankets on the runners, then lifted Whitlo together. Catherine braced and careful, Micah straining with small arms that shouldn't have had to do that work. Whitlo didn't complain. He just nodded once, like he understood this wasn't about comfort. It was about getting him to a place where law might actually notice he was bleeding. The mule started forward with a reluctant pull, sled scraping over frozen dirt. Catherine walked ahead with the rope, leaning into the cold. Micah kept pace beside the runners, eyes flicking between Whitlo's face and the road ahead like he was afraid one of them might vanish if he didn't keep looking. If you've never driven into a frontier town with blood in your wagon, I'll tell you what it does to you. Every sound gets louder. Every creak of harness feels like it's announcing you. Every distant door slam feels like it might be someone coming to finish what they started. Sheridan rose out of the dust and cold haze like a promise that didn't quite believe in itself. Boardwalks, hutch rails, smoke from chimneys, faces turning as the sled scraped in. Catherine didn't stop to explain to anyone on the street. She didn't detour to find help. She guided that mule straight to the sheriff's office like a woman who'd already decided shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. Micah tied the mule off with fingers stiff from cold. Whitlo lay bundled, eyes open, breathing shallow, and Catherine stepped up onto the porch, placed her hand on the door, and pushed inside. She didn't come for sympathy.
She came to make sure the town had to see what happened when powerful men decided a hungry widow didn't count.
The next day, the sky stayed bright and cruel. You ever notice that kind of daylight? The kind that looks clean, almost pretty, but doesn't warm a thing. It's the sort of light that makes a hard place feel even harder, because it shows you everything exactly as it is. Catherine was out back splitting kindling when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, several. Coming in slow, measured steps, like the riders weren't worried about being challenged. She didn't run, she didn't call out, she just stopped, let the axe head rest on the block, and listened. Out on the frontier, you learn the difference between a man passing by and a man arriving. These hooves had purpose. Catherine stepped up onto the porch with the axe handle still in its grip, not swinging it, not threatening, just holding something solid because the world had turned soft under her feet. Whitlo came beside her a moment later, coat buttoned high, collar up, hands visible and empty. That detail matters. He wasn't trying to start a shootout, he was trying to keep one from happening. Micah hovered in the doorway behind him, half hidden, trying to be brave the way children try, by standing very still and hoping fear won't notice him. The riders stopped at the fence line, 5 of them. Not drifters, not cowboys out for a laugh. Their horses were fed, their saddles fit. They sat those animals like men who believed they had permission to be there. And then one of them did something small that Catherine would remember later like a brand on the inside of her eyelids. He struck a match. That little flare of light in the wind, in the middle of a cold yard, didn't belong. It looked like a signal. He lit a cigar slow, taking his time, letting that flame show. Now think about that for a second. If you ride out to a widow's cabin and you're so confident you stop to light a cigar, you're not there to negotiate. You're there to collect. The stock detective sat at the front, calm as if he'd come by for coffee. "Evening," he called, like the word meant something out there. "We're here for the calf." Catherine didn't step off the porch. She didn't invite him closer. She kept her voice even. "You can look. If it's yours, take it." The detective's eyes slid to Whitlo. "And if it's not?" Whitlo answered for her quiet and firm. "Then you ride off." One of the riders laughed, short and dry, like the idea of being told no was a joke they hadn't heard in a while. The detective didn't laugh. He didn't raise his voice either. That's what made him dangerous. He stayed smooth. "We've got witnesses saying you've been feeding on beef, and we've got a boy in that house who can tell us what he saw." Micah flinched behind the doorframe like the words were a hand reaching for him. Catherine's whole body tightened, not fear for herself, something sharper. "Leave my son out of your mouth," she said. The detective's tone stayed polite, the way men get polite when they know they're holding a knife. "Then hand over the calf and we'll all sleep easy." Whitlo didn't move. He didn't puff up. He didn't try to impress anyone. He just said, steady as fence wire pulled tight, "You don't threaten a child to collect a rumor." And right there in that yard you could feel how thin the territory's law really was. In town a badge might matter. Out by a creek with 5 armed riders and nobody watching, law was just a word people used when it suited them. The wind kept moving through the cottonwoods. Dust drifted around the horses' legs. The cigar smoke blew sideways. Everything looked almost calm if you ignored the fact that one wrong breath could turn it bloody. Then one rider made it worse. He swung down from his saddle and walked to the fence. Not toward the cabin yet. He grabbed a fence rail and yanked like he owned it, like he was demonstrating something. A rail popped loose with a squeal and nails, and that sound did something to Catherine. It wasn't just wood, it was her boundary being tested, her last thin claim to order. She stepped off the porch without thinking, axe handle lifting. Whitlo murmured, barely loud enough for her to hear, "Don't." But Catherine kept moving, not fast, not wild, just a mother walking toward the line where her world ended. Because if she let them pull her fence apart like it didn't matter, what would they do next? Walk into her cabin, put hands on her boy, take everything and call it range business? The riders saw the axe and froze, fence rail hanging awkward in his grip. For one heartbeat, everyone went still. And then a gunshot cracked. Not from Catherine, not from Whitlo, from the fence line. Maybe the rider's finger slipped, maybe somebody flinched,
Maybe one of those men was nervous in a way he couldn't admit. I can't tell you for sure. I can only tell you what it did. It ripped the calm right in half. Horses jumped sideways. Dust erupted under hooves. The calf bawled under the lean-to like it understood exactly what that sound meant. Micah screamed from the doorway. Pure panic, the kind that comes from a child realizing adults can't control everything. Whitlo moved fast then. Not heroic, not cinematic, just fast. He stepped forward with his hands out, palms open, shouting for them to hold, for everyone to stop. And in the scramble, another shot answered. Whitlo staggered. No dramatic spin, no big speech, just a sudden hitch in his body, a hand clamping hard to his side, blood darkening his coat like spilled ink. Catherine dropped the axe and ran to him. She grabbed him under the arm and dragged him backward toward the porch boards, teeth clenched, boots slipping a little in loose dust. You don't realize how heavy a man is until you're trying to move him while your heart's hammering and your hands are shaking. The riders hesitated. That's the part people don't like to admit about violence. Even the men who bring it often don't know what to do once it actually happens. Once there's blood on the ground and a child screaming, the story stops feeling clean. The stock detective's face got hard. "Last chance," he called. "That calf, or next time we don't stop with warnings." Then they turned and rode off, leaving hoofprints like a signature. And Catherine stayed there on the porch edge, kneeling beside Whitlo, with Micah crying behind her and the wind still blowing like nothing had changed at all. Because the land doesn't care who gets hurt, it just keeps moving. But everything had changed.
On Savage West stories, this is usually the part where people lean in and wait for the clean moment, the showdown, the limping hero walking into town, jaw set, hand near his gun, ready to make the whole thing simple. But that's not how most of the West worked, not the real one. Most of it was compromise that tasted like ash. Most of it was folks trying to survive without getting themselves buried over somebody else's pride. And when the hearing in Sheridan broke up, that's exactly what you could feel in the air. The room emptied, boots scraped on plank floors, and the truth didn't exactly win. It just got written down. Catherine Hale walked out of there holding Micah's hand, her face steady, her stomach tight. The stock detective walked out too, calm as ever, like the fine was a mosquito bite and the town's disapproval was just weather. Whitlo lay upstairs above the livery, feverish and pale, paying for that moment in Catherine's yard with every breath he took. And then the range did what it always does when humans start arguing about ownership. It kept moving. 2 days later, Catherine went back out by the creek bend, searching the reeds and mud where she'd first found the calf. Wind combed through the cottonwoods with that dry, rattling sound, like bones knocking together. The water ran slow and dark under a thin skin of cold light. They found the calf down there, dead, half in the reeds, stiff and small, like it had tried to crawl into the only shelter it knew and the world had simply refused. Maybe it broke a leg in the panic. Maybe it froze after the riders came. Maybe coyotes got there first and then moved on. Nobody could prove much of anything. And out there, that's how the land keeps its secrets. It doesn't care about your version of the story. Now think about that for a second. All that threat, all that violence, and in the end, the thing they fought over was just gone. Not redeemed, not returned, just gone. Without the calf as evidence, the cattle outfit's interest cooled fast. Not because they suddenly grew a conscience, because the prize wasn't worth the cost once town eyes were watching. Power doesn't always crush you head on. Sometimes it just shifts its weight and steps somewhere else. Catherine brought Whitlo home as soon as he could sit upright without going gray in the face. The ride back was slow. Every rut felt like a hammer. He moved like an old man for a while, then like a younger man who'd learned what a bullet really costs. And Micah stayed close to him. Not worshipful, not calling him Pa, not like a story trying to tie things up neat, just close, the way a boy gets when he's seen someone bleed on his doorstep and still show up the next day. Kids remember that kind of thing. It becomes part of how they measure the world. Winter kept coming after that. Not the big catastrophe folks would talk about a few years down the line when storms wiped out herds and pride all at once.
This was just the everyday kind of winter that still had teeth, snow that crusted hard, wind that found every crack in the cabin boards, nights when the dark pressed against the window like it wanted in. Whitlo kept showing up even when his side still ached. He didn't bring speeches. He didn't bring grand promises. He brought work. He fixed what broke. He hauled water when the creek skimmed over. He patched harness with needle and awl, hands steady in lamplight. In town, he'd trade labor for flour and salt because cash was rare and pride didn't fill a pantry. He walked careful for a while, then straighter, and Catherine watched him with the kind of quiet attention you give a tool you're not sure you can afford to lose. Catherine didn't soften into some different person just because help had arrived. The territory wouldn't allow it. She stayed careful, she stayed stubborn, and she kept her eyes open. Some nights when the stove burned low and Micah finally slept, Catherine would sit at the table with a tin cup in her hands and stare at the door like she was listening for the next set of hoofbeats. The cabin would creak under the wind and the lamp flame would shiver, and her face would have that same hard stillness she'd worn in the dry goods store back in Sheridan. Whitlo would notice. He always noticed more than he said. "They're not coming tonight," he'd tell her, quiet. And Catherine would answer just as quiet, "You don't know that." Whitlo never argued. He'd just nod once, because he didn't. Not really. That's the tax you pay for standing your ground out there. Even when you win, you keep paying. You pay in sleep. You pay in flinches you don't want anyone to see. You pay in the way your ears stay tuned to the road long after the road has gone silent. And still, the day is stacked up. The fence stayed standing. The pantry stopped looking like an accusation. Micah's cheeks filled out a little. The cabin held. No victory parade, no final showdown. Just the slow, stubborn work of keeping a life from collapsing. That's the West most people don't ask for, but it's the one that happened. The one where survival wasn't a moment. It was a long stretch of mornings, and the decision to keep going, even when the world proved it could hurt you any time it pleased.
Spring came back to the creek like nothing bad had ever happened. That's the part that can make you feel mean if you let it. The snowmelt ran loud and silver. The cottonwoods started pushing green at the tips, and the air carried that damp, clean smell like the land had just washed its hands. Catherine Hale stood on her porch one morning and watched the water move. You could see it in her face. She wanted to believe the season meant safety, but she'd lived long enough out here to know seasons don't promise anything. They just change. Micah was already in the yard, running off energy he hadn't been able to spare all winter. He chased nothing in particular, just the feeling of having room to breathe again. His boots kicked up wet dirt and last week's dust, and his laugh came easier now. Not because the world got kinder, because his belly wasn't empty. Whitlo healed slow. A wound like that doesn't vanish just because the weather turns. Some mornings he moved stiff, testing his side before he tried to lift anything heavy, but he kept working anyway, careful and stubborn, like pain was something you acknowledged and then set aside. He fixed fence posts that winter had loosened. He rewired sections where frost had pulled the staples. He did it without talking big, without acting like the land owed him a reward. He just did the next task, then the next. And Sheridan kept growing. You could feel it even from the road. More wagons, more voices, more hammering, new frames going up beside old buildings like the town was trying to outpace its own rough beginnings. A place like that doesn't become civilized all at once. It just gets busier. And sometimes busy is the same thing as safe. Sometimes it isn't. That cattle outfit that had sent those riders, they didn't come back to Catherine's place. Not that spring, not that way. That doesn't mean they changed their minds about what they were entitled to. It just means they did what big power often does when it's being watched. It shifts. It finds an easier target. It moves on like weather. No apology, no closure, just a different direction. Now think about that for a second. The West wasn't always a place where the bad men got punished and the good folks got rewarded. A lot of times, the only victory you got was being too much trouble to bother with. Catherine understood that. She didn't celebrate. She didn't go soft. She kept her routines. She counted supplies. She watched the horizon the way people do when they've learned that quiet can turn loud without warning. But the cabin felt different. The shelves held a little more, flour, beans, salt. Not abundance, just enough to stop the panic from living in every corner. The stove stayed lit. The roof held. The fence stood straighter. Small things, but out here, small things are what keep you alive. Micah watched Whitlo a lot, in that careful way children have. Not just curiosity, measurement. The boy was old enough to remember a man being shot in his yard, old enough to remember how quickly adults can vanish. Whitlo didn't try to buy Micah's affection. He didn't bring toys or tell tall stories. He just kept showing up. He spoke plain, he did what he said he'd do, and little by little Micah started to look for him the way you look for a porch light when dusk comes on. One evening the sky went orange over the plains, soft and almost gentle. Catherine and Whitlo stood on the porch together, shoulders close but not touching, both of them facing the land like it might speak first. Catherine finally said, "You could have left the night you got shot." Whitlo didn't turn to look at her right away. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "So could you." Catherine let out a breath that was almost a laugh but didn't quite make it. "I had nowhere to go." Whitlo's voice came rough, honest, no romance in it. "I did, and I still came back." No kiss, no speech, just that fact set down between them like a board laid across a gap. Sometimes that's how trust gets built, not with pretty words, with a man staying where he could have walked away. Later, inside, the three of them ate a plain meal by lamplight. 10 plates, simple food. The wind still moved outside, but it didn't feel like it owned the place anymore. Micah chewed slow, looking from his mother to Whitlo and back again, like he was trying to understand what staying really meant. Catherine rested her hand on Micah's shoulder, brief and steady. Whitlo watched that gesture and looked away, like he didn't want to make a big thing out of something that mattered. And me, I seen